Long before Tenochtitlan emerged as the political center of the Basin of Mexico, Nahua scribes and chroniclers referred to a northern place called Aztlan. The term appears primarily in late post-classic pictorial manuscripts and early colonial alphabetic narratives that sought to preserve Mexica memory after the conquest. These sources constitute the entire verifiable textual basis for Aztlan, and they define its characteristics, symbols, and narrative function. Understanding Aztlan begins not with assumptions about geography, but with the limited corpus through which the concept is historically attested. The earliest depictions of Aztlan are preserved in documents such as the Codex Boccherini, also known as the Tira de la Peregrinación, which dates to the early colonial period and reflects pre-conquest visual conventions. The manuscript traces the Mexica migration from Aztlan to the Basin of Mexico through a series of footprints, place glyphs, and year signs. The opening scene identifies Aztlan through a compound glyph, a small island surrounded by water, often marked by a white or pale color field. This imagery led scholars to interpret the name from Aztli, white or heron, and Tlan, place of, producing the often cited translations, place of whiteness, or place of herons. The etymology is consistent across several Nahuatl lexical traditions and provides the first textual anchor for defining how Nahua scribes conceptualized the site. Other manuscripts, including the Codex Auburn and the Historia de los Mexicanos por sus Pinturas, repeat the motif of an island origin. In several variants, Aztlan is depicted as a water-bordered settlement from which multiple lineages depart. These depictions reflect a broader Mesoamerican pattern of origin water symbolism, evident in Mixtec and Maya traditions as well. The consistency in Aztlan's water symbolism suggests that scribes treated the site not merely as a geographic point, but as a cosmologically charged origin space. This is further supported by the presence of Chichimastok, the place of 7 caves, which often appears in the same narrative cluster. While Aztlan and Chichimastok are distinct concepts in some traditions, later narratives frequently merge them. This fusion illustrates how lineage origins, migration episodes, and cosmological models intersected in late post-classic historiography. Alphabetic sources compiled shortly after the conquest provide additional, although still limited, detail. Bernardino de Sahagun's informants, interviewed during the creation of the Florentine Codex in the mid-16th century, described Aztlan as the homeland of the Mexica and other Nahua groups. Sahagun's record is filtered through the concerns of early colonial ethnography, yet it preserves consistent oral traditions regarding a northern point of departure. His informants place Aztlan in a distant region characterized by water, whiteness, and ancestral authority. Notably, they do not identify its precise location, nor do they consistently link it to any known archaeological site. This absence of geographic specificity underscores the conceptual nature of Aztlan in Nahua historical thought. The textual corpus also demonstrates variation between manuscripts, revealing that Aztlan was not a fixed narrative element. For example, the Codex Aztlan, produced in the 16th century, presents a migration sequence in which Aztlan serves more as a symbolic threshold than as a detailed settlement. By contrast, the Chimalpoan Annals, written using Nahuatl alphabetic script, incorporate Aztlan into a broader framework of Shishimec ancestry and political legitimization. These variations show that Aztlan functioned flexibly within different Nahua historiographic agendas. Interpretively, this suggests that Aztlan was both a genealogical anchor and a political resource, used to position lineages within established migration narratives. Spanish chroniclers influenced later representations of Aztlan by attempting to align Nahua accounts with European geographic frameworks. Some colonial authors proposed northern regions extending into what is now the U.S. Southwest, while others tried to correlate Aztlan with known settlements mentioned in earlier Spanish expeditions. These identifications do not appear in pre-conquest pictorials and therefore cannot be treated as indigenous attestations. Their presence highlights an important methodological point. Early colonial records reflect a dialogue between Nahua informants and Spanish editors, and the concept of Aztlan in these sources is shaped by both perspectives. This complicates efforts to reconstruct earlier traditions, making it necessary to distinguish indigenous textual motifs from colonial interpretive overlays. A number of core attributes, however, remain stable across the manuscript tradition. First, Aztlan is portrayed as an ancestral point of origin from which the Mexica and related groups depart. Second, it is consistently associated with water symbolism, whether through island imagery, lake motifs, or aquatic fauna such as herons. Third, Aztlan is situated temporally in the distant prehistory of the Mexica migration, preceding all politically significant events of the 13th and 14th centuries. These stable elements indicate that Aztlan served as a conceptual beginning within Nahua historical reasoning. Its role was to locate the Mexica within a broader chain of ancestral movements rather than to describe a specific location remembered through direct memory. From an academic perspective, the most important feature of the textual record is the late appearance of Aztlan narratives. With no surviving epiclassic or early post-classic inscriptions referencing the site, the earliest known representations come from manuscripts produced shortly before or after the conquest. This temporal proximity suggests that fully developed Aztlan narratives may reflect post-classic historiographic synthesis rather than direct recollections of early first millennium migrations. This does not invalidate the concept. Rather, it clarifies its historical function. Origin narratives across Mesoamerica typically merged older memories, political legitimization strategies, and cosmological structure. Aztlan fits within this broader pattern. By the early colonial period, the concept of Aztlan had become sufficiently standardized that multiple manuscripts preserved its imagery in similar forms. This convergence suggests that Nahua scribes shared a common narrative template by the 16th century, even if earlier forms of the tradition cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The textual evidence, therefore, defines Aztlan as a culturally coherent origin concept rooted in late post-classic historiography. As the textual concept of Aztlan stabilizes in these sources, the next analytical question concerns chronology. Identifying when Mexica scribes believe their ancestors departed Aztlan provides the temporal framework required to assess possible archaeological correlations in later sections. Between 600 and 1200 CE, northern Mexico was in motion. Archaeological, linguistic, and paleo-environmental evidence all indicate that this period saw significant population shifts across the transitional zone separating Arido-America from Mesoamerica. These movements formed the broader historical landscape into which later Nahua migration narratives were integrated. To situate the concept of Aztlan within this context, it is necessary to examine not a single migration event, but a centuries-long sequence of demographic pressures and regional transformations that produced recurring southward flows. Archaeological surveys in regions such as Zacatecas, Durango, Chihuahua, and the Bajío show a pronounced pattern of settlement fluctuation beginning around the Epiclassic period, ca. 600 to 900 CE. Excavated sites, including La Quemada, Calchahuites clusters, and dispersed hilltop fortifications, display evidence of population contraction by the 10th century. Records indicate shifts in residential density, abandonment of formerly fortified centers, and a reduction in long-distance trade signals, particularly changes in obsidian sourcing. Analysts have noted a decrease in material originating from northern sources, such as Cerro de las Ventanas, and increased reliance on central Mexican networks. These patterns suggest evolving regional connections and possible population displacement. Environmental reconstructions support this interpretation. Paleoecological cores from the Basin of Mexico, as well as lacustrine sequences from Chihuahua and Zacatecas, demonstrate periods of prolonged drought between the 10th and 12th centuries. Studies of pollen loss, desiccated lake margins, and reduced arboreal cover indicate climatic stress across much of northern Mesoamerica. According to regional climate modeling, diminished rainfall would have constrained agricultural productivity, especially in transitional environments already dependent on limited seasonal precipitation. The cumulative evidence suggests that drought cycles acted as a structural force encouraging mobile groups to relocate southward into more reliable agricultural zones. These demographic pressures interacted with linguistic processes visible in the distribution of Uto-Aztecan languages. Comparative linguistic studies demonstrate that the Proto-Uto-Aztecan language community likely originated in a northern region well outside the Mesoamerican core. Although scholarly debate continues over the precise locus, ranging from the Great Basin to northwestern Mexico, there is broad consensus that Uto-Aztecan languages expanded southward over multiple centuries. Within this family, the Nahuan subgroup represents a later branch. Linguistic phylogenies suggest that Proto-Nahuan may have differentiated approximately 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, placing its early speakers somewhere in northwestern or north-central Mexico, with proposed homelands including Sonora, Sinaloa, Durango, and Nayarit. This linguistic chronology does not identify Aztlan, but it establishes that the ancestors of the Mexica did not originate in the Basin of Mexico. Instead, their language family's distribution fits within the broader north-to-south movements documented archaeologically. The correspondence between linguistic diversification and archaeological settlement change provides two interpretive insights. First, demographic mobility appears to have been structurally recurrent in northern Mexico, rather than tied to isolated events. Second, the Mexica migration narrative fits within a long-standing regional pattern in which political groups moved southward into the more urbanized core zones of Toltec and later post-classic states. The early post-classic period, ca. 900 to 1150 CE, further clarifies this framework. Archaeologists have documented increased cultural interaction zones stretching from Durango into the Bajío and then toward central Mexico. Pottery styles, including red-on-buff ceramics and incised wares, demonstrate shared influences over wide geographic ranges. These material parallels indicate frequent movement of either populations or cultural practices, and in some regions, both. By the 11th century, new centers of activity appeared in central Mexico, including Tula, whose influence radiated outward in trade and possibly migration networks. These developments may have contributed to later central Mexican traditions claiming northern origins, a pattern widely observed among post-classic elites. From a chronological standpoint, the most significant alignment occurs between 1100 and 1300 CE, the period in which several Nahua groups entered the Basin of Mexico. Documentary evidence from the Chronica Mexicaotl and the Annals de Cuautitlan places the Mexica arrival in the region between 1200 and 1250 CE. This timing corresponds with the final phase of northern settlement abandonment and with environmental instability recorded in lake cores from Chihuahua and Zacatecas. Archaeologists have uncovered fortified hilltop sites abandoned by the 12th century, matching the time frame during which Nahua-speaking migrants were reportedly moving south. This parallel does not confirm a direct link, but it establishes a plausible historical horizon in which real population movements could have been preserved, later condensed into the simplified framework represented by the Aztlan narrative. A second interpretive insight concerns the relationship between migration and political identity. Many post-classic polities legitimize themselves by claiming northern or Shishimec ancestry. This ideological pattern complicates the historical evaluation of Aztlan. The fact that northern origins were socially valued suggests that some components of the Aztlan narrative may reflect political positioning rather than direct memory. Yet the archaeological and environmental data demonstrate that large-scale northern migrations were historically real. Therefore, the Aztlan tradition likely merges authentic demographic processes with later political codification. A third analytical point concerns the duration of mobility. Northern Mexico during the Epiclassic and early Postclassic was not characterized by a single mass migration, but by repeated cycles of movement, driven by climate variability, changing trade networks, and the emergence of new political centers to the south. Given this pattern, it is historically reasonable that Nahua-speaking groups participated in these movements at multiple stages, even if the specific sequence remembered in later manuscripts is simplified. By situating the Nahua migration tradition within this multi-century context, the chronological window for evaluating Aztlan becomes clearer. The evidence points to significant mobility between 600 and 1300 CE, with heightened movement during the 10th to 12th centuries. This provides a realistic temporal frame for assessing whether the Mexica memory of a northern homeland reflects long-term regional dynamics, later ideological reconstruction, or both. To understand where Aztlan might have been situated within this broader landscape, the next step is to examine how Nahua sources describe its physical characteristics. The codices describe Aztlan as a place of water, but the north contained many such places. To evaluate these references, it is necessary to compile every geographic indicator associated with Aztlan across late post-classic pictorial manuscripts and early colonial narratives. These descriptions appear in highly stylized forms, yet several consistent motifs allow researchers to distinguish plausible geographic cues from purely symbolic elements. The Codex Boccherini, probably created in the mid-16th century but based on earlier pictorial prototypes, offers the clearest visual representation. It begins with Aztlan depicted as an island settlement surrounded by water, with small canoe paths radiating outward. Human figures stand beside a hill surmounted by a temple, and in some versions, a heron or white bird is placed near the water's edge. The imagery emphasizes insularity and aquatic setting, and the presence of a bird, particularly one akin to a heron, has been interpreted as a literal fauna reference. Records indicate that herons were common in marshland and coastal environments across western and northwestern Mexico, suggesting that this motif, while symbolic, may reflect environments familiar to northern migrants. The Aubin Codex, compiled in the 16th century, corroborates this insular portrayal. It depicts Aztlan as a small island located within a larger water body, often connected by a single canoe route. The island theme recurs across multiple manuscripts, suggesting that water played a central role in the remembered landscape. Scholars note, however, that island imagery can also function symbolically within Nahua writing. Islands were depicted for places of origin, emergence, or separation from ordinary space. Thus, while the aquatic setting in these codices is consistent, it may blend symbolic meaning with physical memory. Early colonial chroniclers add textual descriptions that both clarify and complicate the picture. Fray Diego Durán states that Aztlan was located toward the north, and describes it as a place where the Mexica lived in a tranquil environment surrounded by water. His accounts also reference the term whiteness, echoing the possible etymology of Aztlan, place of whiteness, or place of herons. According to Durán, this whiteness could refer to the brightly plastered buildings or reflective water surfaces. However, analysts recognize that Durán often synthesized indigenous traditions with Spanish interpretive frameworks, making his descriptions useful but not strictly reliable. Chimalpohin, writing in the early 17th century, preserves several traditions from the central Mexican annals. He emphasizes Aztlan's aquatic infrastructure and includes references to marshes and canoe routes. Chimalpohin also notes the presence of surrounding hills, suggesting a mixed lacustrine and upland environment. His accounts maintain the association between Aztlan and whiteness, though the specific referent, salt, plaster, light-colored birds, or ritual symbolism remains ambiguous. Linguistic evidence does not permit a definitive interpretation, but the consistent recurrence of the term across sources indicates that whiteness was a defining marker in Nahua conceptualizations of the homeland. To determine whether such descriptors reflect genuine geographic memory, scholars compare them to wetlands and lacustrine zones in northern and western Mexico during the period 800 to 1200 CE. Paleoenvironmental studies document substantial marshlands in Culiacan, fed by the Humaya and Tamazula rivers before their confluence. These environments supported dense bird populations, including herons, and maintained extensive backwater zones navigable by canoe. Archaeologists have identified multiple pre-Hispanic settlements on elevated platforms within this region, although they do not match the architectural features described in the codices. Nevertheless, the Culiacan Basin demonstrates that northern aquatic landscapes were not rare and could plausibly inform collective memory. Further inland, the region surrounding La Quemada in Zacatecas presents a contrasting environment. While La Quemada itself is an upland site with defensive architecture, the broader region included river systems and seasonal wetlands that could produce marsh-like conditions in favorable years. These wetlands were less extensive and less stable than coastal systems, making them less likely candidates for long-term island settlement imagery. However, Some analysts argue that collective memory could preserve generalized impressions rather than exact topography, especially after centuries of migration. In western Mexico, the coastal plains and lagoons of Nayarit and Sinaloa offer additional parallels. Before modern hydrological changes, these areas contained numerous shallow lagoons, estuaries, and islands accessible by canoe. Archaeological surveys from the region document shell middens, fish traps, and small platform settlements dating to the first millennium CE. These features correspond with descriptions of aquatic environments but provide no direct evidence linking them to Nahua-speaking groups. Nonetheless, the environmental fit reinforces the point that northern and northwestern Mexico included multiple landscapes resembling the codical depictions. Two interpretive insights arise from this comparison. First, the geographic markers in the codices, water, islands, marsh birds, whiteness, do not point to a single unique environment. Instead, they correspond to a broad category of northern wetlands. This suggests that the codices preserve thematic, rather than cartographic, memory. Second, the recurrence of whiteness imagery could refer to ecological or material traits common to multiple locales, such as salt flats, white plastered temples, or large populations of white herons. Therefore, the descriptor likely functioned as both a name element and a symbolic attribute. From a methodological standpoint, researchers treat the codical imagery not as a literal map but as a structured dataset containing repeated environmental motifs. By identifying overlapping features across manuscripts and cross-referencing them with paleoenvironmental records, scholars construct a range of plausible landscape types. This approach does not locate Aztlan but establishes criteria for evaluating proposed sites. These include the presence of wetlands or marshes, insular settlement patterns, canoe-accessible waterways, and possible associations with prominent bird species. Having defined the conceptual, chronological, and geographic framework, the next chapter turns to archaeology. The archaeological north was diverse, far more than any single origin story suggests. Between 500 and 1300 CE, northern and northwestern Mexico contained multiple cultural horizons with distinct settlement patterns, material traditions, and subsistence systems. Understanding these cultures is essential for evaluating which regions could have supported populations that eventually moved south into the Basin of Mexico. The objective is not to identify Aztlan directly, but to establish the archaeological settings that framed demographic movement during the Epiclassic and early post-classic periods. One of the most prominent cultural horizons in north-central Mexico is La Quemada, located in the modern state of Zacatecas. Occupied primarily between 500 and 900 CE, La Quemada is characterized by fortified hilltop centers, defensive walls, terraces, and ceremonial structures built with stone slab masonry. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of obsidian use, long-distance trade connections, and small-scale agricultural systems reliant on limited rainfall. However, La Quemada's defensive architecture and upland position contrast sharply with the island depictions in the codices. Records indicate no substantial marshlands or lacustrine environments in its immediate vicinity during its peak occupation. While La Quemada reflects regional mobility and interaction, its environmental and architectural profile does not align with the Aztlan tradition as described in early Nahua sources. A related cluster of sites, often grouped as the Calchahuites culture, occupied parts of Zacatecas and Durango from approximately 300 to 1000 CE. These communities built platform structures, ball courts, and plazas supported by mixed agricultural and foraging economies. Ceramic assemblages show influences from central Mexico and the Bajío, suggesting extensive exchange networks. Yet, as with La Quemada, the Calchahuites region is predominantly upland and semi-arid. Archaeologists found no evidence of island-based settlements or extensive marsh systems. The cultural practices of Calchahuites populations offer insight into long-distance interactions, but they lack features directly comparable to the aquatic imagery associated with Aztlan. Farther northwest, the Hohokam culture flourished between 500 and 1450 CE in what is now southern Arizona. The Hohokam developed large-scale canal irrigation systems, platform mounds, and extensive trade networks linking them to Mesoamerican regions. Shell, macaw feathers, copper bells, and ceramic motifs show sustained interaction with Western Mexico. While the Hohokam environment was not lacustrine, their sophisticated canal infrastructure demonstrates that water management played a central role in their society. However, linguistic and cultural evidence does not connect the Hohokam with Uto-Aztecan-speaking Nahua groups. Their technological influence reached northern Mexico, but current research indicates they were not part of the migrations associated with Aztlan traditions. Adjacent to the Hohokam region, the Mogollon culture occupied parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and Chihuahua. From 500 to 1300 CE, Mogollon communities constructed pit houses and pueblos, developed painted ceramics, and engaged in mixed agriculture and foraging. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of exchange with both Hohokam and Casas Grandes regions. While the Mogollon inhabited environments near rivers and seasonal watercourses, they did not build island settlements, and their cultural markers differ markedly from those found among later Nahua groups. The Mogollon horizon contributes to the broader picture of northern diversity, but does not align with the geographic or symbolic attributes associated with Aztlan. The Pacoime, Casas Grandes culture, flourishing from 1200 to 1450 CE in northwestern Chihuahua, represents one of the most complex northern polities of the late pre-Hispanic period. Pacoime developed multi-story adobe architecture, ritual ball courts, macaw breeding facilities, and ceremonial water systems. Excavations revealed elaborate trade ties with western Mexico, including shell imports and copper bells. Although Pacoime reached its peak after the probable period of Nahua migrations, its regional precursors, settlements in the Rio Casas Grandes corridor, were active during the 11th and 12th centuries. These communities inhabited riverine environments but did not build island-based settlements. Additionally, linguistic evidence places the early Nahua farther south and west, making Pacoime an unlikely candidate for Aztlan. Nonetheless, the region demonstrates the architectural and ceremonial complexity present in the north before Spanish arrival. The Aztlan culture, spanning the coastal regions of Nayarit and Sinaloa between approximately 900 and 1350 CE, is frequently discussed in the Aztlan debate due to the similarity in names. However, Aztlan is an archaeological designation unrelated to the mythic Aztlan. Aztlan sites display coastal maritime trade, shell working, and distinctive red-on-brown ceramics. They illustrate a region integrated into Pacific coastal exchange networks, receiving obsidian from Jalisco and pottery influences from central Mexico. Despite these connections, there is no evidence linking Aztlan populations to Nahuan linguistic groups. Their environment, characterized by lagoons, estuaries, and coastal plains, resembles the aquatic motifs in the codices, but the absence of cultural or linguistic continuity prevents establishing a direct relationship. Two interpretive insights arise from comparing these cultures. First, no single northern horizon matches all features found in the Aztlan narrative, whether symbolic or environmental. Instead, the archaeological north reveals a mosaic of societies with varying interactions, landscapes, and mobility patterns. Second, several regions could have supported migrating groups who later moved into central Mexico. These include the river valleys of Durango, the coastal lagoons of Sinaloa and Nayarit, and the transitional zones where Uto-Aztecan speakers are known to have lived. From a methodological standpoint, separating archaeological cultures from later ethnonyms is essential. Terms such as Xiximec and Aztlan, used in post-classic manuscripts, are not equivalent to archaeological labels such as Calchahuites or Aztlan. Archaeologists rely on material evidence, architecture, ceramics, subsistence strategies, to define cultural horizons. Ethno-historical sources, by contrast, reflect the socio-political identities remembered by later groups. These categories intersect only partially, and conflating them obscures both archaeological and historical clarity. The presence of fortified upland centers, canal systems, coastal lagoons, and riverine corridors indicates that multiple ecological settings existed in which mobile populations could have formed, dispersed, or coalesced during the Epiclassic and early post-classic periods. None of these settings directly confirms an Aztlan-like origin, but all frame the broader landscape in which north-to-south migration occurred. With the regional landscape mapped, we can test specific proposals for Aztlan's location. Many places resemble Aztlan, but none align perfectly. Over the past century, scholars and enthusiasts have proposed more than a dozen potential sites for the mythic homeland, reflecting both the codical descriptions and environmental plausibility. For analytical clarity, these proposals can be grouped into four primary clusters: northwestern Mexico, including the modern states of Sinaloa and Nayarit, the Baja Gulf region, the Bajío Plateau, and the American Southwest. Each cluster exhibits strengths and limitations when evaluated against archaeological evidence, chronological compatibility, and the pictorial and textual features preserved in the codices. The northwestern Mexico cluster emphasizes coastal plains and lagoon systems, particularly the Culiacan River Basin and adjacent wetlands. These areas align with codical imagery, including marshes, canoe-accessible waterways, and abundant bird populations, notably herons. Archaeological surveys demonstrate occupation during the early post-classic, and settlement patterns suggest small platform villages adapted to water-rich environments. However, radiocarbon dating indicates that the peak habitation in some wetland areas postdates the probable migration of Nahua groups into central Mexico, around 1200 to 1250 CE. Additionally, no linguistic or material evidence directly links these populations to early Nahua speakers, making identification tentative at best. The Baja Gulf region has also been suggested, largely due to the presence of coastal lagoons and estuaries that fit the island-in-water motif. Archaeological sites such as La Paz and Loreto display fishing-based economies and evidence of limited interaction with mainland Mesoamerican networks. Yet, settlements were relatively small and isolated, and the ecological conditions, arid deserts, punctuated by coastal lagoons, contrast with the richer agricultural landscapes typically required to sustain migration groups of the size implied in the Mexica chronicles. Furthermore, there is little chronological overlap with the hypothesized migration period. In the Bajío Plateau, scholars have pointed to river valleys and small lake systems as potential locations. The region, encompassing parts of Guanajuato, Querétaro, and Jalisco, hosted a series of fortified and semi-urban centers during the Epiclassic and early post-classic. Material culture, including red-on-buff ceramics and obsidian exchange networks, aligns with broader Mesoamerican patterns. While these sites could have supported mobile populations moving toward central Mexico, they fail to replicate the insular or lacustrine characteristics emphasized in codices. Moreover, linguistic evidence for Nahua speakers in this region prior to the 12th century is sparse, limiting the likelihood of a direct connection. Finally, the American Southwest cluster includes proposed locations in southern Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of northern Chihuahua. Advocates cite Hohokam canal systems, Mogollon pit house settlements, and riverine environments that could produce marsh-like impressions. While these societies demonstrate sophisticated water management and long-distance trade, there is no archaeological or linguistic evidence linking them to Nahua-speaking populations. Chronological alignment is also problematic, as many Hohokam sites reached peak complexity after the early stages of Mexica migration, and the distances involved suggest improbable logistical connections for sustained migration events. A systematic evaluation of these proposals involves multiple criteria: hydrology, settlement structure, ceramic assemblages, architectural forms, and temporal compatibility with the hypothesized migration window of approximately 1100 to 1250 CE. Synthesis tables developed by modern researchers demonstrate that no candidate site satisfies all conditions simultaneously. Northwestern coastal wetlands correspond to water imagery but lag slightly in chronology. The Bajío Plateau aligns with logistical feasibility but lacks insular motifs. Pacoime and other Casas Grandes sites present monumental architecture but no Nahua linguistic evidence. Each site satisfies some, but not all, codical and environmental expectations. Two interpretive insights emerge from this evaluation. First, the multiplicity of plausible sites reinforces the notion that Aztlan functioned primarily as a symbolic ancestral reference, codifying northern origin and collective memory rather than pinpointing a literal city. Second, recurring environmental features, wetlands, islands, rivers, and associated bird species, suggest that codical imagery drew selectively on landscapes familiar to northern Nahua-speaking populations, preserving ecological themes even as specific locations became generalized or abstracted over time. Ultimately, the archaeological record provides constraints but no definitive solution. While it is possible to identify regions capable of supporting migrating populations, no site satisfies every criterion derived from codical and textual analysis. This underscores the importance of integrating archaeology with linguistic, genetic, and ethno-historical data to build a multidimensional understanding of Nahua origins. By examining where migrations could have plausibly originated, researchers can contextualize Aztlan within historical processes of mobility, environmental adaptation, and cultural memory, without insisting on locating a precise material counterpart to the mythic homeland. If Aztlan cannot be identified archaeologically, the next logical step is to consider what linguistic and genetic evidence may reveal about the origins and migration pathways of Nahua-speaking populations, providing a complementary line of inquiry to the codices and settlement data. Languages and genes often travel longer distances than myths can accurately remember. Comparative linguistics and population genetics provide complementary tools for tracing the deeper origins of Proto-Nahuan communities, offering an independent line of evidence to assess the plausibility of migration traditions such as Aztlan. By combining these approaches, scholars can reconstruct the temporal and spatial dynamics of population movements over millennia, distinguishing cultural memory from historical fact. Linguistic reconstruction places Proto-Uto-Aztecan speakers in the southern United States or northern Mexico approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. This broad temporal range derives from glottochronological methods calibrated with archaeological and environmental data. Proto-Uto-Aztecans subsequently diversified into several branches, with Proto-Nahuan emerging roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. Phylogenetic models suggest gradual southward dispersal rather than a single mass migration, with multiple waves of population movement contributing to the eventual settlement of central Mexico. Early north-to-south migrations likely involved adaptive strategies to semi-arid and riverine environments, consistent with the broader archaeological patterns observed across the Epiclassic and early post-classic periods. Within the Nahuan branch, comparative studies of phonological and lexical features indicate affinities with northern Uto-Aztecan dialects, particularly those in Sonora, Sinaloa, and north-central Mexico. These linguistic markers support a scenario in which Nahua-speaking groups originated outside the Basin of Mexico and arrived later as part of a multi-generational southward dispersal. Importantly, these reconstructions suggest that by the time the Mexica reached the Valley of Mexico, Nahuan speakers had already undergone several centuries of mobility and regional adaptation. Genetic studies provide an independent line of evidence supporting these conclusions. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and autosomal variation among modern Nahua populations show admixture with central Mexican groups, consistent with migration followed by integration into local populations. The genetic signal indicates that initial northern migrants were relatively small in number, with subsequent intermarriage and gene flow shaping the demographic profile recorded in the post-conquest period. These patterns reinforce the notion that the Mexica and related groups were recent arrivals, rather than autochthonous to the Basin of Mexico, corroborating the linguistic evidence. The combination of linguistic and genetic data yields several interpretive insights. First, the southward dispersal of Proto-Nahuan speakers demonstrates that migrations in northern Mesoamerica were gradual, multi-phased, and adaptive, rather than a single rapid movement. This pattern aligns with environmental and archaeological evidence for episodic mobility across Aridoamerica and the northern transition zone. Second, the admixture detected in genetic studies suggests that population memory preserved in Nahua codices may reflect collective ancestral identity rather than precise geographic knowledge. While migrants retained a cultural memory of northern origins, centuries of integration and adaptation would inevitably blur spatial and chronological details. Third, linguistic and genetic chronologies provide constraints on the potential temporal depth of cultural memory. Proto-Nahuan diversification occurred roughly 1 millennium prior to the Mexica migration into central Mexico, and memories of northern homelands are likely derived from these earlier periods. However, the retention of detailed geographic information over such spans is improbable. The Aztlan tradition, therefore, may preserve generalized ecological or symbolic motifs, wetlands, islands, herons, whiteness, rather than recording the specific location of settlement. Another important consideration is the role of political legitimation. Codical narratives and colonial chronicles emphasize northern origin as a marker of ancestral prestige. The Mexica Empire leveraged these traditions to construct ideological claims to authority in the Basin of Mexico. Linguistic and genetic evidence suggests that real demographic events underlie these narratives, but the codified story in manuscripts like the Boccherini Codex and Aubin Codex likely served both mnemonic and political functions. In other words, Aztlan simultaneously encodes migration history and acts as a legitimizing ancestral symbol. Finally, integrating these data allows for a clearer assessment of what Aztlan could plausibly represent. The convergence of linguistic phylogenies, genetic admixture patterns, and archaeological migration windows supports the idea that the Nahua-speaking populations remembered a northern origin, consistent with the codice's broad narrative. Yet the precision of this memory is limited. Environmental motifs, settlement imagery, and directional references reflect collective memory filtered through centuries of transmission, rather than eyewitness knowledge of a specific geographic site. By tracing these linguistic and genetic pathways, scholars gain a data-driven understanding of Nahua origins. The evidence suggests that migrations from northern regions into central Mexico were real, multi-generational processes that ultimately shaped the ethnogenesis of the Mexica and related groups. At the same time, Aztlan as a codical and mythic construct encodes selective aspects of this history, emphasizing ecological motifs, social lineage, and ideological significance, without providing a precise geographic location. With these origins outlined, the next stage follows the narrative trajectory of the migration as described by Nahua sources, integrating textual, symbolic, and chronological evidence to reconstruct the route, experiences, and socio-political strategies of the Mexica as they journeyed from the conceptual homeland of Aztlan to the Basin of Mexico. In Nahua tradition, the homeland does not begin with a city, but with 7 caves. The Chicamoztoc narrative, literally place of the 7 caves, appears prominently in multiple post-classic and early colonial sources, including the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, the Codex Xolotl, and annalistic compilations preserved by Chimalpahin and other chroniclers. Across these texts, the 7 caves function as loci from which various Nahua-speaking groups emerge, symbolizing lineages, ethno-political divisions, or distinct migration cohorts. Rather than describing a single physical site, the narrative encodes information about group identity, organization, and the conceptual structuring of ancestral memory. The Historia Tolteca Chichimeca situates the caves in proximity to Aztlan, portraying emerging tribes as moving southward into the more fertile valley lands. Each cave is associated with a named lineage or subgroup, and some codices supplement textual information with pictorial markers that indicate relative positions, numbers of individuals, and sequence of departure. In the Codex Xolotl, similar visual conventions depict groups leaving individual caves with bundles or canoes, reinforcing the idea of discrete cohorts following separate paths along convergent migration routes. These representations demonstrate that the caves function as symbolic origin points, structuring migration memory according to social divisions rather than topographical reality. Scholarly interpretations largely converge on the view that Chicamoztoc embodies a metaphoric charter of ethnic differentiation. The repeated motif of 7 caves may reflect ritual or cosmological numerology, as well as a mnemonic device for cataloging tribal subgroups. Comparative analysis shows that the narrative preserves distinctions between Mexica, Tepaneca, Acalua, and other Nahua-speaking peoples, enabling codifiers to organize genealogical memory and political lineage coherently. In this framework, the caves codify social hierarchy, alliances, and intergroup relationships prior to arrival in central Mexico. Archaeological parallels provide additional, though non-literal, support for this interpretation. Sites such as Malinalco and Calcatsingo in the Epiclassic period feature cave temple complexes integrated into ceremonial centers, suggesting that caves functioned as ritual and symbolic spaces. While these complexes postdate the earliest phases of Nahua migration, they demonstrate the broader cultural significance of caves as loci of origin, ancestry, and sacred activity. The thematic correspondence, linking caves with lineage, ritual, and social organization, reinforces the interpretive framework that Chicamoztoc need not correspond to a specific geographic location. Multiple textual variants further complicate the spatial reading of Chicamoztoc. In some codices, the caves are situated adjacent to a conceptual Aztlan, emphasizing continuity between the homeland and ancestral lineages. In other manuscripts, they appear as a distinct mythic waypoint along the migratory route, highlighting the episodic progression of tribal movements. These discrepancies indicate that codifiers were primarily concerned with organizing social memory, rather than providing topographical precision. Accordingly, Chicamoztoc functions as an ethnopolitical schematic, a tool for preserving collective identity during periods of migration and settlement. Two interpretive insights emerge from this analysis. First, the Seven Caves motif illustrates how mythic frameworks encode social and political information. Rather than serving as literal geographic markers, the caves reflect systematic awareness of tribal structure, hierarchy, and movement. Second, the narrative demonstrates the importance of migration as a formative process for Nahua societies. By embedding distinctions between cohorts within a shared cosmological narrative, codices ensured that later generations could trace ancestry, maintain social boundaries, and negotiate political legitimacy upon arrival in central Mexico. The chronologically consistent depiction of cohort emergence also supports the view that Chicamoztoc represents collective memory of migration phases. Codices often portray sequential departures, with some groups taking lead roles in establishing settlements while others follow later. This reinforces the concept that migrations were multi-generational and strategically organized, rather than single, spontaneous displacements. The symbolic structure of the caves thus encodes both temporal sequencing and social differentiation, enabling historians to infer patterns of movement and cohesion among early Nahua groups. Finally, the narrative establishes the framework for leadership and governance prior to departure. While the caves define group identity, they also set the stage for emerging political hierarchies, which the codices later associate with specific tribal leaders or lineages. These figures guide migrations, negotiate resources, and orchestrate departures from Aztlan, demonstrating the integration of social, political, and cosmological knowledge in a single narrative construct. Once the tribal divisions are established, the codices move quickly into descriptions of migration leadership and the first ruptures with Aztlan. This transition sets the stage for the subsequent chapters, which follow the southward movement of Nahua cohorts, the consolidation of political authority, and the eventual establishment of new settlements in central Mexico, culminating in the foundation of Tenochtitlan. Before the Mexica were conquerors, their leaders were interpreters of omens, migrations, and lineage identity. Across Nahua migration narratives, elite leadership is consistently emphasized, particularly the roles of priestly figures who guided communities through both ritual and logistical challenges. Accounts preserved in the Codex Boturini, Codex Aubin, and the Historia Tolteca-Chichimeca highlight how figures associated with Huitzilopochtli and other patron deities served as spiritual and political anchors during periods of movement, ensuring group cohesion, resolving disputes, and interpreting signs that dictated the timing and direction of migration. Groups such as the Mexica, Acalua, Matlatzinca, Calca, and Tepanica are repeatedly depicted as organized under lineages led by combined secular and priestly authority. Leadership often manifested as councils of elders and ritual specialists who negotiated resource allocation, migration routes, and interactions with other groups. While the codices present these roles within a sacred framework, portraying leaders as divinely sanctioned interpreters of omens, archaeological evidence suggests that such authority likely also addressed practical concerns, including ecological pressures, intergroup competition, and trade facilitation. Leadership functioned as a mechanism to maintain cohesion in mobile societies facing unpredictable landscapes and resource scarcity. Archaeological correlates support these interpretations. Early epiclassic and post-classic temple complexes in northern and transitional Mesoamerican regions often include elevated platforms, central plazas, and burial caches that suggest hierarchical organization. Excavations at La Quemada and Calchahuites, for instance, reveal elite burials accompanied by ritual paraphernalia, including scepters, shell ornaments, and ceremonial blades, indicating a class of individuals responsible for both spiritual and socio-political governance. Iconographic evidence, such as glyphs of priestly attire and depictions of ritual specialists in early codices, further underscores the importance of hereditary authority intertwined with religious legitimacy in maintaining social order during migration. The priesthood's role extended beyond ritualized oversight to encompass decision-making under uncertainty. Migration along uncertain routes, through arid or marshy zones, required coordinated planning and responsive leadership. Leaders would have interpreted environmental signals, mediated conflicts among cohorts, and orchestrated the timing of departures, arrivals, and settlement consolidation. Such functions are reflected metaphorically in codical depictions of Huitzilopochtli directing the Mexica with fire or omens, suggesting that divine guidance codified practical social mechanisms. Hereditary transmission of leadership was critical. Lineages maintained both ritual knowledge and authority, ensuring continuity across successive stages of migration. By embedding sacred authority in specific families or offices, Nawa groups could preserve identity and social cohesion even when facing external pressures. This pattern is reinforced by iconographic evidence from northern ceremonial centers, where elites are consistently represented with insignia of office, indicating recognized hierarchies that could be mobilized to manage both ceremonial and logistical tasks. A second interpretive insight involves the integration of spiritual legitimacy with political power. Codical narratives often link leadership directly to the will of Huitzilopochtli or other deities, providing ritual justification for group decisions such as departure from Aztlan or selection of settlement locations. Archaeological evidence of temple complexes associated with early Nawa communities demonstrates that ritual authority and political organization were materially expressed in architecture, burial treatment, and iconography. This suggests that the mythic framing of priestly guidance mirrors practical strategies used to maintain cohesion and coordinate migration. The interplay of lineage, elite authority, and ritual specialization allowed groups to navigate complex social and environmental landscapes. Leaders mediated relationships between migrating cohorts, negotiated alliances with neighboring populations, and ensured adherence to shared cosmological norms. These mechanisms not only facilitated mobility but also created enduring frameworks for political legitimacy, which later Mexica elites could reference retrospectively. By claiming divine sanction for migration and conquest, rulers in Tenochtitlan reinforced their authority while situating their lineage within a longer historical and spiritual trajectory originating in Aztlan. Finally, examining leadership in these migration narratives highlights the adaptive strategies of mobile societies. Far from purely symbolic, the guidance attributed to priestly figures likely reflects real social structures designed to manage risk, maintain group cohesion, and coordinate long-distance movement. The codices, by presenting these roles within a divine framework, encode both historical function and ideological significance. This dual purpose allows modern historians to infer patterns of authority and social organization while acknowledging the mythic overlay present in textual sources. As leadership narratives solidify, the codices describe the pivotal moment that forces the Mexica to depart Aztlan, setting in motion the southward migration that would ultimately lead to the foundation of Tenochtitlan and the consolidation of Mexica political and religious identity in the Basin of Mexico. The Mexica did not drift south, they were driven. Across multiple codices, the departure from Aztlan is depicted with varying motives: divine command, social tension, or direct conflict with local authorities. The Codex Boccherini emphasizes a celestial mandate, portraying Huitzilopochtli as instructing the Mexica to leave, while the Codex Auban and Historia Tolteca Chichimeca include internal disputes and competition with neighboring lineages as contributing factors. Each variant performs a narrative function, legitimizing subsequent migrations and framing the Mexica as divinely guided yet responding to tangible pressures. Historical analysis suggests several plausible triggers underlying these accounts. Climatic variability in northern Mexico between 900 and 1150 CE, including prolonged drought episodes, may have stressed water and arable resources, reducing the capacity of settlements in river valleys, marshlands, and coastal lagoons to support growing populations. Archaeologists have documented settlement abandonment patterns in regions such as Durango, Zacatecas, and Nayarit during this interval, corresponding with periods of environmental instability. In some cases, clusters of abandoned villages appear to coincide with the migration window inferred for Proto-Nahuatl groups, suggesting that ecological stress could have catalyzed southward movement. Competition for fertile land represents a second potential driver. The northern transition zone featured limited arable areas interspersed with semi-arid highlands. Emerging polities and mobile communities, including La Quemada and Calchahuite centers, may have intensified territorial disputes. Codical references to intragroup tension or disputes with established local rulers could encode memory of these demographic and political pressures, later reframed as divine instruction to leave. Disruption of trade circuits also emerges as a plausible factor. Northern and coastal regions were integrated into wider exchange networks, including obsidian, marine shells, and exotic goods moving toward central Mexico. Archaeological evidence indicates episodic interruptions in these networks, whether due to environmental change, intergroup conflict, or shifts in regional dominance. For a migratory population dependent on trade and resource access, such interruptions could incentivize relocation, which the codices ultimately present through the lens of sacred sanction. Another consideration involves the expansion of neighboring cultural spheres, particularly La Quemada's fortified centers and the Aztlan maritime network along the Pacific coast. These entities exerted influence over local resources, strategic corridors, and trade routes. The pressure of increasingly organized polities in the north may have generated competition that contributed to the departure, a pattern that could have been remembered and mythologized in the Aztlan narrative. Two interpretive insights emerge from comparing codical and archaeological data. First, the multiplicity of departure motifs. Divine command, social tension, external threat, reflects the codice's role in encoding historical stressors in narrative form. Each variation emphasizes different causal factors, but all indicate that migration was a response to constraining circumstances. Second, demographic, environmental, and political pressures likely operated in concert rather than isolation. The forced departure narrative may thus preserve a collective memory of stress-induced migration, reinterpreted through divine causality to legitimize later Mexica settlement and authority. The spatial and temporal evidence aligns with this interpretation. Radiocarbon dating, paleoenvironmental reconstructions, and settlement abandonment surveys indicate that populations across Durango, Zacatecas, and Nayarit were mobile, episodically relocating or consolidating in response to climatic or political stress. While no single event can be identified as the definitive trigger for the Mexica departure, these data support a model in which migration was strategically adaptive, even if later codified as a divinely mandated exodus. Moreover, codical imagery reinforces the combination of social and environmental pressures. Depictions of canoes navigating waterways, families carrying bundles, and priestly figures guiding cohorts suggest an organized response to multiple stressors. The repeated motif of Huitzilopochtli's guidance, while mythic in form, overlays a practical pattern of leadership and group coordination, encoding the memory of migration as both socially structured and cosmologically sanctioned. Finally, the departure from Aztlan illustrates the broader principle that mythic narratives often preserve kernels of historical experience while simultaneously performing ideological functions. The story situates the Mexica as proactive, divinely guided agents rather than passive victims, framing southward migration as a purposeful and sanctioned endeavor. This dual function allows historians to interpret the narrative as reflective of demographic stress and environmental or political pressures, while acknowledging the mythic overlay that structured Mexica collective memory. With the departure set, The migration narrative moves into trackable stages as the groups journey towards central Mexico, where subsequent chapters trace settlement patterns, interactions with indigenous populations, and the consolidation of early Mexica political and religious structures. The migration trail narrows as the landscape shifts from desert margins to fertile high valleys. Using codical itineraries, toponyms, and archaeological settlement data, scholars have reconstructed the pathways likely followed by Nahua-speaking groups, including the Mexica, as they moved from northern homelands into the Bajío region and onward to the northern valleys of central Mexico. These reconstructions do not propose a single linear route, but rather a multi-generational corridor, shaped by environmental constraints, resource availability, and existing settlements. The journey was episodic, with groups pausing to establish temporary camps, exploit seasonal resources, or integrate with other populations. Sites such as Tula Chico and Cerro Barajas, along with numerous valley settlements in modern Guanajuato and Querétaro, provide critical archaeological evidence for this phase of migration. Excavations reveal patterns of demographic fluctuation between 900 and 1200 CE, including intermittent occupation, small-scale fortifications, and localized ceramic assemblages consistent with north-to-south movement. Settlement sequences suggest that incoming Nahua groups coexisted with or succeeded earlier epiclassic populations, indicating that migration involved negotiation with pre-existing social networks rather than unpopulated landfall. Hydrological reconstructions further constrain feasible routes. Valleys with reliable water sources, seasonal streams, and arable soils would have dictated stopover locations. Radiocarbon sequences indicate temporal overlap with climate oscillations, requiring groups to adjust travel timing and settlement duration. Similarly, obsidian provenance studies trace material flows from northern sources through the Bajío corridor, revealing connections between migrating populations and trade networks, as well as access points for sustenance and tool acquisition during transit. These datasets corroborate codical references to specific place names and landmarks along the route, enhancing the archaeological plausibility of the reconstructed corridor. Migration through the Bajío also reflects differentiation among Nahua groups. Mexica cohorts likely moved alongside or in parallel with Acalua, Tepanica, and other related lineages. Codices depict staggered departures and sequential settlements, suggesting multi-generational movement rather than a single expedition. This pattern aligns with demographic modeling. Small family units or lineage-based cohorts could adapt more flexibly to environmental variability and social negotiations with resident populations, while maintaining cohesion under shared leadership and ritual oversight. Interpretive insights emerge from this reconstruction. First, the corridor demonstrates the importance of ecological and logistical constraints in shaping migration routes. Groups selected paths that balanced access to water, fertile soils, and defensible terrain, reflecting sophisticated understanding of highland environments. Second, the interplay of codical references, archaeological data, and material sourcing underscores how textual narratives encode spatial and environmental knowledge, even if partially mythologized. Finally, the corridor highlights that migration was structured, adaptive, and socially mediated, involving both cooperation and negotiation with pre-existing communities rather than unilateral occupation. This environmental and demographic context establishes the conditions for entry into the northern highlands of the Basin of Mexico, where incoming Nahua groups encountered established polities, agricultural networks, and trade circuits. Understanding these constraints and pathways allows historians to trace the Mexica migration with both chronological and spatial precision, situating codical accounts within the material realities of the central Mexican landscape. Once within the central highlands, the Nahua groups encountered pre-existing political systems, setting the stage for subsequent interactions, alliances, and conflicts that would shape settlement patterns and the eventual foundation of Tenochtitlan. The newcomers entered a region whose history was already ancient. By the late early post-classic and early middle post-classic, ca. 1150 to 1300 CE, central Mexico was a mosaic of city-states, fortified towns, and semi-nomadic polities. The legacy of Tula, with its monumental architecture and expansive trade networks, still resonated across the northern basin of Mexico, while Shishimec groups maintained influence in peripheral valleys. Emerging centers such as Culhuacan exerted political and ritual authority, controlling access to agricultural lands, lakes, and strategic trade corridors. For migrating Nahua groups, including the Mexica, this landscape presented both opportunities and challenges. They encountered pre-existing hierarchies, negotiated subordinate statuses, and occasionally engaged in conflicts as they sought footholds within the valley system. Codical and annalistic sources, such as the Annals de Tlatelolco and Chronica Mexicaotl, describe Mexica subordination to local rulers during initial settlement phases. The narratives recount tributes paid to Culhua lineages, temporary alliances, and occasional disputes over land and ceremonial precedents. Archaeological evidence aligns with these accounts. Settlement layers at Xaltecan and surrounding valleys show incremental occupation by new groups, shifts in material culture, and interspersed construction that suggests integration with established populations rather than unilateral conquest. Ceramics, for instance, reflect a hybridization of northern and central motifs, including adoption of red-slipped wares alongside traditional Mexica forms, indicating both continuity and adaptation in daily practices. Architectural and ritual evidence also illustrates cultural blending. Early Mexica compounds exhibit platform structures, ceremonial courtyards, and temple orientations consistent with local norms, while maintaining certain northern stylistic elements in masonry and iconography. Burial practices, particularly secondary interments and elite offerings, demonstrate adherence to ritual expectations of dominant local polities while preserving distinctive markers of Mexica identity. This combination of integration and differentiation facilitated the emergence of a recognizable Mexica cultural signature within the archaeological record. Interactions were not uniformly peaceful. Codical narratives and ethno-historical accounts describe localized conflicts, often framed as contests over tribute, ritual precedents, or settlement rights. Archaeological indicators include fortification walls, abrupt changes in occupational layers, and evidence of site abandonment or relocation, which align temporally with the arrival of northern migrant cohorts. These episodes suggest that Mexica integration into the Central Highlands involved negotiation, adaptation, and occasional confrontation, shaping the social landscape and influencing subsequent patterns of settlement and alliance formation. Two interpretive insights emerge from this period. First, the Mexica experience illustrates the process by which migrant groups become culturally and politically distinct within an established system. Through selective adoption of local practices, strategic alliances, and maintenance of internal lineage cohesion, the Mexica were able to consolidate identity while navigating pre-existing hierarchies. Second, cultural hybridization, evident in ceramics, architecture, and ritual practice, demonstrates the reciprocal nature of integration. While migrants adapted to local norms, indigenous polities also incorporated or tolerated elements of northern culture, facilitating a dynamic interplay that would shape central Mexican society. Trade and resource access played a critical role in integration. Lakes, canals, and fertile valley floors supported both subsistence agriculture and the redistribution of goods such as obsidian, ceramics, and marine shells. Mexica settlements appear strategically located near these resources, reflecting both environmental acumen and political negotiation. Codices indicate tribute obligations and ceremonial participation as mechanisms through which the Mexica maintained legitimacy and negotiated standing within central Mexican polities, reinforcing the connection between social integration and ritual observance. By the end of this phase, the Mexica had emerged as a distinctly identifiable group within the archaeological and textual record. They retained markers of northern origin, including certain linguistic and symbolic traditions, while simultaneously absorbing elements of local governance, ceremonial architecture, and material culture. This dual identity enabled them to survive, adapt, and prepare for subsequent phases of territorial expansion. Integration eventually turns to displacement, creating the conditions for Mexica migration deeper into the basin. As local alliances shifted, resource pressures intensified, and political opportunities arose, the Mexica moved strategically to secure more autonomous settlements. This transition sets the stage for the next chapter, which traces the consolidation of Mexica communities, the negotiation of political authority, and the eventual foundation of the core city that would become Tenochtitlan. The journey ends where the basin's lakes begin. Archaeological and textual evidence places the Mexica near Chapultepec by the early 14th century, marking the final transitional phase of their southward migration. Codices such as the Codex Boccherini and Codex Aubin describe temporary settlements and interactions with established polities, while annalistic records provide chronologies that situate these movements around 1300 CE. This region, on the northern edge of the Basin of Mexico, offered strategic access to freshwater, arable land, and defensible terrain, but also presented ecological and political challenges that shaped Mexica's settlement decisions. Demographic models suggest that Mexica populations were growing but remained relatively small compared to surrounding polities like Culhuacan. Archaeological surveys indicate that occupation sites near Chapultepec were modest in scale, reflecting the constraints of limited lake access, seasonal flooding, and competition for cultivable land. Material culture reveals continued adaptation. Ceramics and lithic tools reflect both inherited northern traditions and innovations derived from central highland interactions. This demonstrates that Mexica groups were transitioning from mobile migration cohorts to sedentary communities, preparing for more permanent settlement while negotiating social integration with dominant city-states. The Mexica account of expulsion from Chapultepec illustrates the interplay of political pressure and social negotiation. According to the codices, conflicts with local authorities, often framed in mythic terms, forced the Mexica to seek new territory. Archaeological and ethno-historical evidence supports a pattern of episodic displacement in the northern basin, consistent with competition over fertile plots, control of water resources, and integration into regional tribute networks. These pressures compelled the Mexica to move southward, eventually reaching the islands of Lake Texcoco, where they would establish their central city. Interpretive analysis highlights several key points. First, this stage marks the convergence of mythic narrative and historical reality. The migratory motifs of Aztlan and Chikamaztoc are now mapped onto tangible geographic locations within the basin. Second, Mexica's settlement decisions were shaped by environmental constraints, demographic growth, and interpolity relations, rather than solely by divine instruction. Finally, the transitional phase near Chapultepec illustrates the mechanisms through which migrant groups evolved into politically coherent entities capable of founding enduring urban centers. By the end of this phase, the Mexica migration cycle that began with Aztlan reaches its terminus. Mobile lineages consolidate into structured communities, leadership hierarchies become formalized, and ritual authority continues to intertwine with political governance. The memory of Aztlan, while retaining symbolic resonance, begins to function less as a literal migration waypoint and more as a marker of ancestral legitimacy and collective identity. With the Mexica settled in the basin, the concept of Aztlan changes function, from a record of migration and displacement to a political and ideological reference point, legitimizing claims to authority, sacred lineage, and cultural continuity within the emerging Mexica state. Newcomers adapted quickly to the rhythms of the lakes. Upon entering the Basin of Mexico, migrant groups, including the Mexica, faced the challenge of establishing settlements within a densely populated and ecologically complex environment. Archaeological surveys of early Mexica sites, particularly on the northern shores of Lake Texcoco, reveal compact compounds and elevated platforms that accommodated both residential and ritual functions. These early settlements were strategically situated near freshwater sources and arable land, often adjacent to pre-existing Otomi and Tepanek communities, highlighting the need for negotiation and adaptation in a politically competitive landscape. Settlement morphology reflects a combination of inherited northern practices and innovations responding to local conditions. Dwellings were constructed using perishable materials, arranged in clustered households, and complemented by open spaces likely used for communal activities. Subsistence strategies integrated small-scale agriculture, fishing, and exploitation of lake-edge resources. Evidence of early Chinampa-style cultivation appears sporadically, suggesting experimentation with intensive agriculture to support growing populations. Obsidian and ceramic assemblages indicate participation in established trade networks, allowing incoming groups to secure tools, ritual objects, and goods essential for daily life and socio-political integration. Community identity began to crystallize through symbolic markers. Early glyphic emblems, referenced in codices and appearing in ceramics and portable artifacts, indicate nascent attempts to encode lineage, cohort affiliation, and social hierarchy. Small ritual spaces, including shrines and offerings, reflect both continuity with northern ceremonial practices and adaptation to the religious frameworks of the basin. This duality allowed migrant communities to maintain cultural memory while signaling integration with local polities. Interpretive insights highlight the adaptive strategies of early Mexica settlements. First, settlement choice and resource use reflect environmental intelligence. Proximity to lakes and fertile soils was balanced against defensibility and political considerations. Second, material culture and ritual practices demonstrate a deliberate synthesis of inherited and local traditions, facilitating both social cohesion and external legitimacy. Third, the creation of emblems and ritual spaces indicates that identity was socially negotiated and materially enacted, providing a foundation for future political consolidation. By situating themselves within the lake's dynamic ecology, early Mexica settlements established the structural, economic, and symbolic foundations for their emergent identity. These communities were small, adaptive, and strategically integrated, positioning the Mexica for subsequent phases of political negotiation and territorial expansion. As settlements formed stable communities, identity narratives became increasingly important, providing the framework for internal cohesion and external recognition in a landscape of competing polities. Aztlan became less a place than an argument for who the Mexica were. In the early decades of settlement within the Basin of Mexico, memory of a northern homeland functioned as a central organizing principle for community cohesion and political legitimacy. Codices, oral histories, and material culture reveal that references to Aztlan were selectively invoked to distinguish the Mexica from neighboring Otomi, Tepanec, and Acalua communities, providing a shared origin story that reinforced internal solidarity while marking ethnic and ritual boundaries. Far from mere nostalgia, these narratives operated as tools of social negotiation, establishing collective identity in a contested landscape. Ritual discourse incorporated Aztlan memory in ceremonies, offerings, and the structuring of sacred calendars. Lineage claims frequently invoked ancestors associated with the homeland, creating genealogical continuity that linked contemporary leadership to divine sanction. Artistic motifs, including glyphs, portable artifacts, and early codical illustrations, often referenced migratory journeys or emblematic elements of Aztlan, such as water, birds, or the seven caves, functioning as symbolic markers of group cohesion and sacred authority. These visual and performative markers reinforce narratives embedded in oral and codical traditions, enabling community members to internalize and enact shared identity. The deployment of Aztlan memory also served political purposes. Leaders leveraged the homeland narrative to legitimize authority, align ritual roles with divine mandate, and justify collective decision-making. By framing Huitzilopochtli's guidance as historically continuous from Aztlan to contemporary settlement, elites could assert both spiritual and administrative legitimacy. Codices portray councils and priestly figures invoking ancestral memory during ceremonies, suggesting that origin narratives were actively managed to reinforce hierarchical structures and negotiate social compliance. Interpretive insights reveal the selective and adaptive nature of this process. First, Aztlan functioned as a flexible ideological tool, amplified or downplayed according to evolving political circumstances. In periods of external threat or internal consolidation, references to northern origins became more prominent, reinforcing legitimacy and group cohesion. Second, the narrative facilitated ethnic differentiation, invoking Aztlan signaled belonging to the Mexica lineage while demarcating outsiders. Third, material and ritual expressions of homeland memory indicate that myth was materially and socially enacted, not merely recited, embedding identity within lived experience. Over time, the integration of Aztlan memory into everyday and ceremonial life solidified Mexica identity, providing a shared historical consciousness that bridged generational transitions. This framework enabled communities to coordinate labor, ritual, and political organization while maintaining a coherent sense of distinctiveness within the densely populated basin. By grounding authority and social cohesion in both myth and material practice, early Mexica elites laid the foundation for the community's capacity to expand territorially and politically. The consolidation of identity soon fed into the early stages of expansion, as Mexica groups leveraged both ecological knowledge and ideological cohesion to negotiate settlement opportunities, establish alliances, and assert influence across the basin. This process set the stage for the transformation of the Mexica from integrated migrant communities into emergent polities capable of territorial ambition and institutional development. To survive in the basin, the Mexica needed more than origin stories, they needed allies. Upon settling along the northern shores of Lake Texcoco, the Mexica entered a densely populated and politically complex landscape dominated by established city-states. Chief among these were the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, whose economic and military reach extended across the northern basin. Codical sources, including the Codex Xolotl and Annals de Tlatelolco, document early tributary obligations imposed on the Mexica, reflecting both subordination and the strategic incorporation of newcomers into regional hierarchies. Archaeological evidence complements these textual accounts. Excavations of early Mexica compounds near the lake reveal compact fortifications, storage facilities, and artifacts indicative of tribute production, suggesting that the Mexica were integrated into resource extraction and redistribution networks under Tepanec supervision. Ceramic assemblages and obsidian distribution patterns indicate participation in centralized economic systems, which likely facilitated both subsistence and political negotiation. These material traces confirm that early Mexica communities were active participants in regional exchange networks, rather than isolated or purely migratory groups. Military obligations played a parallel role. The Mexica were required to provide warriors to Tepanec campaigns, both demonstrating loyalty and gaining exposure to broader strategic practices. Codices depict early conflicts and skirmishes in which Mexica contingents participated, offering insight into how the community acquired military experience and cultivated alliances while simultaneously asserting its presence. This combination of tribute and martial service reflects a pragmatic adaptation to local power structures, ensuring survival while gradually enhancing autonomy. Interpretive insights highlight the interplay between origin narratives and political strategy. References to Aztlan and ancestral migrations were frequently invoked during negotiations with regional powers, functioning as rhetorical claims to legitimacy and historical precedent. By framing themselves as divinely guided descendants of a prestigious homeland, Mexica leaders could assert continuity and identity even under Tepanec dominance. This illustrates how mythic memory served as both internal cohesion and external negotiation tool, integrating social, political, and ideological dimensions. Cultural hybridization emerged alongside these alliances. Architectural and ritual elements in early settlements reflect both Tepanec influence and retained northern traditions, demonstrating that Mexica communities were selectively integrating external norms while preserving internal identity markers. Burial practices, ceremonial spaces, and emblematic artifacts reveal a negotiated balance of adaptation and cultural continuity, enabling the Mexica to establish credibility without losing distinctiveness. These early interactions with regional powers established patterns that would define Mexica political evolution: strategic alliance-making, tribute negotiation, martial contribution, and the deployment of ancestral narrative for legitimacy. By participating in Tepanec networks, the Mexica gained experience, resources, and social leverage that would later underpin territorial expansion and the foundation of autonomous city-states. With political foundations laid, we now analyze the religious and symbolic roles Aztlan played in Mexica statecraft, tracing how mythic memory informed ritual authority, legitimacy claims, and the ideological consolidation of the emerging Mexica polity. Aztlan entered the sacred map. By the early 14th century, The memory of a northern homeland was not only a social and political marker but had been fully integrated into Mexican religious cosmology. Codical sources, including the Codex Borgia and Codex Federveri, alongside later colonial chronicles, depict Aztlan through symbolic elements such as water, whiteness, herons, and caves. These motifs were woven into ritual narratives, calendrical observances, and ceremonial architecture, forming a mythic geography that anchored Mexican identity within a sacred spatial framework. The homeland, once a point of historical memory, became a cosmological reference, linking divine mandate, ancestry, and territory. Water features prominently, reflecting both the literal lakes and rivers of northern origins and the symbolic association with fertility, purification, and life cycles. White or luminous imagery is connected to spiritual purity and celestial alignment, while herons, often depicted in codices and ritual paraphernalia, serve as avian intermediaries between the human and divine realms, reinforcing the sanctity of migration memory. The motif of caves recalls the Chicamaztoc narrative, functioning as symbolic points of emergence, lineage differentiation, and ritual initiation. By embedding these elements within ceremonial narratives, the Mexica created a multi-layered sacred geography that simultaneously encoded historical memory, social structure, and cosmological order. Interpretive insights reveal innovation alongside inheritance. Many symbolic motifs were present in broader Mesoamerican cosmologies, but the Mexica selectively reinterpreted these elements to reflect their migratory experience and northern origin, thereby distinguishing their ritual landscape from neighboring polities. Ritual sites, temple orientation, and processional pathways frequently mirrored this mythic map, reinforcing the link between geography, ancestry, and divine sanction. The integration of Aztlan into sacred space provided a framework for ritual authority, legitimizing priests, lineages, and ultimately political leadership. Archaeological correlates, such as platform constructions, water-associated shrines, and iconography in early Mexica compounds, demonstrate that these symbolic references were materially enacted rather than purely literary. Ceremonial practices often reenacted aspects of migration, emergence, and divine instruction, embedding Aztlan memory within cyclical ritual and public performance. This codification of space and symbol transformed collective memory into an operational tool for maintaining social cohesion and religious legitimacy. By codifying Aztlan within religious practice, the Mexica ensured that memory of migration and northern origin was continually reinforced through ceremony, visual culture, and spatial experience. The homeland was no longer solely a historical point of departure, but a sacred locus influencing daily life, political authority, and ritual hierarchy. The religious framing sets the stage for Aztlan's political use, where these mythic symbols would be mobilized to assert leadership, justify territorial claims, and integrate diverse populations under a shared ideological and ceremonial framework. Rituals made origins visible. In early Mexica society, ceremonies, calendrical rites, and public performances functioned as active vehicles for reinforcing collective memory, particularly the narrative of Aztlan. Ethnographic accounts by Bernardino de Sahagun and visual depictions in post-classic codices, such as the Codex Mendoza and Codex Bourbonicus, illustrate how migration narratives and ancestral memory were embedded in ceremonial practice. These rituals translated abstract origin stories into tangible, communal experiences, ensuring continuity of identity and legitimizing social hierarchies within Mexica communities. Calendrical ceremonies, timed to agricultural cycles and celestial events, frequently incorporated symbols associated with Aztlan, water, herons, whiteness, and the 7 caves of Chicamaztoc. Seasonal festivals often included processions that reenacted stages of the migration, with priests and lineage leaders performing roles corresponding to ancestral figures. Offerings, dances, and ritualized recitations linked participants to both divine sanction and historical precedent, embedding the homeland narrative in everyday religious and social life. By materializing the Aztlan story through ritual, leaders reinforced both spiritual authority and collective cohesion, ensuring that memory of northern origins remained an active, socially recognized force. Public performances extended this reinforcement into urban and interpolity contexts. Ceremonial displays in plazas and temple precincts communicated lineage legitimacy to external audiences, signaling Mexica identity while asserting continuity with ancestral authority. Codices depict emblematic glyphs, costumes, and iconography that reference migration and sacred geography, allowing audiences to interpret both historical and cosmological significance. This combination of performance, visual representation, and ritualized memory functioned as a mechanism of social pedagogy, transmitting origin narratives across generations. Interpretive insights highlight the interplay of memory, ritual, and politics. First, the performance of Aztlan narratives demonstrates that religion was an instrument of identity formation, not merely personal devotion. Second, ritualized reenactment reinforced hierarchical structures. Priests and elite lineages mediated access to sacred knowledge, asserting leadership legitimacy. Third, integrating origin narratives into ceremonial cycles created a shared cognitive framework that guided behavior, decision-making, and political alignment. Material evidence corroborates these practices. Archaeological features such as platform altars, sacrificial spaces, and processional pathways align with descriptions of festivals and migration reenactments. Portable artifacts and painted codical panels further encode ancestral narratives, suggesting that memory was both visually and spatially embedded. The repetition of these ceremonies ensured continuity of identity, while strengthening the ideological link between sacred narrative and political authority. Religion then merges with realpolitik, as the symbolic power of Aztlan memory is mobilized to justify leadership, guide alliances, and structure emerging political institutions. Through ritual enactment, the Mexica transformed ancestral memory into a practical instrument of governance and social cohesion, bridging myth and material authority. In empire building, a distant homeland becomes a powerful tool. By the time the Mexica began consolidating authority in the Basin of Mexico, memory of Aztlan had been fully integrated into the ideological framework of statecraft. References to the northern homeland were no longer merely markers of lineage or ritual identity. They became active instruments to legitimize dynasties, validate territorial expansion, and structure imperial propaganda. Codical sources, including the Codex Mendoza and Codex Xolotl, alongside colonial chronicles, illustrate how rulers invoked Aztlan to assert ancestral authority, align contemporary leadership with divine precedent, and justify the subjugation of other polities. Dynastic legitimacy relied heavily on Aztlan memory. Mexica rulers consistently traced genealogical lines to northern ancestors, often highlighting figures associated with migration narratives or the leadership of sacred lineages. By linking present authority to an ancestral homeland, rulers could assert continuity of divine sanction, presenting themselves as the rightful heirs of a sacred mandate. Ceremonial inscriptions, glyphic emblems, and palace iconography frequently referenced Aztlan motifs, water, herons, and the seven caves, reinforcing this connection visually and publicly, making the ideological claim both perceptible and performative. Aztlan narratives were also mobilized to validate conquest. By framing expansion as a continuation of migratory and ancestral destiny, Mexica rulers presented imperial campaigns as a restoration of sacred order rather than mere acquisition of land. Conquered communities were rhetorically positioned within a broader ancestral framework, whereby allegiance to Mexica authority symbolized participation in a divinely sanctioned historical continuum. Codices and tribute records reveal repeated ceremonial reinforcement of these claims, ensuring that both conquered populations and Mexica elites recognized the ideological underpinnings of territorial rule. Interpretive insights emphasize the strategic function of myth in governance. First, the Aztlan narrative illustrates how collective memory can be institutionalized to sustain hierarchical authority. Second, its deployment in ritual, visual culture, and historiography demonstrates that myth was actively managed to support political objectives, rather than existing as a passive tradition. Third, the integration of Aztlan into imperial ideology reflects the broader Mesoamerican pattern of using ancestral and migratory narratives to mediate legitimacy, social cohesion, and expansionist policy. Material and textual evidence reinforces these conclusions. Ceremonial precincts, palace murals, and codical illustrations consistently reference migratory symbols, demonstrating that ideological claims were embedded in both urban space and ritual practice. By linking historical memory to governance, the Mexica transformed Aztlan from a mythic origin into a practical instrument of power, shaping perception, loyalty, and social order across the emergent empire. With ideological foundations established, the Empire-era reinterpretations of Aztlan intensify, as rulers increasingly leverage ancestral memory to justify not only their authority, but also the institutional structures and imperial reach that define the Mexica state. The empire reshaped the past to secure the present. Under the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, memory of Aztlan was systematically mobilized as a political instrument. Origin narratives were no longer confined to communal identity or ritual. They were embedded in tribute policy, diplomatic discourse, and ceremonial rhetoric, functioning as a legitimizing framework for imperial authority. Leaders of Tenochtitlan, in particular, emphasized ancestral ties to Aztlan to justify both internal hierarchy and external domination, presenting the Mexica as divinely sanctioned heirs of a sacred migration and rightful stewards of the Basin of Mexico. Tribute policies incorporated Aztlan ideology by framing contributions from subject polities as recognition of the Mexica's ancestral mandate. Codical records, such as the Codex Mendoza, detail tribute lists alongside iconography referencing migration and origin, visually linking material subordination to ancestral legitimacy. Diplomatic correspondence and ceremonial reception of envoys similarly invoked Aztlan motifs, signaling continuity with sacred precedent and reinforcing the perception of Mexico authority as both historical and divinely ordained. In this way, origin memory became inseparable from administrative and political structures, integrating ideology with governance. Ceremonial rhetoric amplified the ideological message. Public festivals, temple dedications, and ritualized reenactments of migratory episodes communicated the Mexica's Aztlan lineage to both internal audiences and tributary communities. Codical illustrations depict processions, offerings, and emblematic symbols that encode migratory motifs, reinforcing political narratives through performative means. The repetition of these symbols and stories across multiple media ensured that the imperial audience, both elite and commoner, recognized the link between ancestral memory and contemporary authority. Interpretive insights reveal the strategic deployment of myth. First, the Triple Alliance demonstrates that memory of origin can be institutionalized to sustain hierarchical structures across multiple polities. Second, the alignment of ritual, iconography, and administration illustrates the integration of ideology into material and political practice, rather than treating myth as purely literary. Third, by consistently linking Aztlan to authority and conquest, Mexica rulers shaped collective perception, reinforcing social cohesion while asserting supremacy over diverse populations. Evidence from archaeological and codical sources corroborates these patterns. Murals, palace reliefs, and codices frequently depict migration motifs alongside political and tribute imagery, confirming that mythic memory was actively used to legitimize empire building. This period marks the apex of Aztlan's political function, as origin narratives transition fully from community cohesion to statecraft and ideological enforcement. The next layer is textual. The codices themselves, which encode these imperial interpretations of Aztlan and provide the primary evidence for understanding how Mexica origin narratives were adapted, formalized, and propagated within the Triple Alliance framework. The scribes of the empire fixed Aztlan into painted memory. During the late post-classic period, codices became a primary medium through which Mexica imperial ideology and origin narratives were formalized and disseminated. Manuscripts such as the Codex Mendoza, Codex Zolil, and Codex Aubin depict Aztlan using a standardized set of visual motifs, including glyphic representations of water, cave entrances, herons, and lineage diagrams. These symbols were not merely decorative. They functioned as ideological instruments, encoding ancestral memory, political legitimacy, and ritual knowledge in a form accessible to both elite and literate audiences. Water bands and lagoon imagery visually reinforced the connection between Aztlan and the sacred lakes, linking migratory memory to both geography and cosmology. Cave symbols, often stylized as 7 apertures or enclosed spaces, reference Chickamaztoc motifs and the emergence of distinct lineages, consolidating ancestral and political identity. Lineage diagrams associated specific rulers or priestly families with these mythic origins, providing genealogical authority for contemporary office holders. By standardizing these representations, scribes created a consistent visual vocabulary that reinforced Mexica claims to divine and historical legitimacy. Interpretive analysis indicates that codical imagery served multiple functions. First, it acted as a memory anchor, ensuring that the narrative of Aztlan persisted across generations and across the geographically dispersed territories of the Triple Alliance. Second, the integration of migratory motifs into administrative codices, including tribute lists and political charts, illustrates how myth was operationalized within the mechanisms of empire. Third, the visual codification allowed for rapid recognition of social and political hierarchies, as glyphs and symbols were legible to elites familiar with the ideological framework, bridging ritual, genealogy, and governance. Evidence from surviving manuscripts shows both conservation and adaptation. Older motifs were preserved, but occasionally reinterpreted to reflect the changing political priorities of the empire. For example, water imagery initially associated with northern lakes was merged with references to Texcoco and Lake Chalco, situating Aztlan memory within the expanded imperial context. Similarly, lineage diagrams emphasized Tenochtitlan's primacy within the Triple Alliance, demonstrating how scribes manipulated ancestral narrative to support current political hierarchies. With imperial interpretations documented, we track how these ideas collapsed in the 16th century, as Spanish conquest disrupted codical production, ritual practice, and political authority. The visual and textual memory of Aztlan, once central to Mexica governance and identity, became mediated through colonial chronicles, ethnographies, and fragmentary codices, preserving mythic memory while simultaneously transforming its function from active state ideology to historical record. Conquest forced the Mexica to rewrite their own beginnings. The Spanish incursion and subsequent colonization of the Basin of Mexico fundamentally altered how Aztlan was remembered, recorded, and interpreted. Codical production ceased in its pre-Hispanic form, and indigenous chroniclers were compelled to translate oral and visual traditions into Spanish-language texts, often under the supervision of missionaries. Works such as Bernardino de Sahagun's Historia General de las Cosas de la Nueva España and the Relation de Michoacán capture Aztlan narratives, but filter them through European historiographical expectations, Christian cosmology, and colonial administrative priorities. This shift introduced selective reinterpretation, syncretism, and textual reframing, transforming the mythic homeland from a living element of identity and political authority into a mediated historical artifact. Colonial dynamics also influenced which elements of the Aztlan tradition were preserved or amplified. Migration narratives, lineages, and ritual motifs were retained insofar as they could be legibly mapped onto European notions of history, geography, and genealogy. Symbolic elements, water, herons, caves, were frequently explained allegorically or moralistically, aligning Mexica history with Christian teleology. Simultaneously, syncretic reinterpretations emerged. The sacred geography of Aztlan was often conflated with European cartographic or classical analogues, while ancestral figures were reframed as semi-historical rulers, saints, or moral exemplars. This process preserved the narrative while detaching it from its prior social and political functions, converting a tool of communal and imperial identity into a literary and ethnographic resource. Interpretive insights emphasized the consequences of colonial mediation. First, Aztlan memory became textually stabilized but functionally transformed, losing its operational role in governance and ritual. Second, the emphasis on written records introduced selective preservation, privileging codical motifs and elite perspectives over popular or ritualistic interpretations. Third, syncretic framing facilitated both cultural survival and ideological containment, allowing indigenous identity to persist within the constraints of colonial society while subordinating Mexica political autonomy. By the late 16th century, Aztlan existed primarily as a documented memory, referenced in chronicles, codices, and ethnographic accounts, rather than as an active locus of social or ritual authority. The narrative persisted as a symbol of origins and identity, but its capacity to structure political, economic, or religious life had largely vanished under colonial administration. This leads into the systematic decline of the old narrative, as subsequent generations of colonial observers and indigenous scribes increasingly prioritized European frameworks, geographic rationalization, and moralized history, further distancing the Aztlan tradition from its pre-conquest civic and cosmological functions. When the political order fell, so too did the narrative that supported it. The Spanish conquest dismantled the Mexica state and its surrounding polities, severing the social and political networks that had sustained Aztlan memory for centuries. Oral transmission of genealogies, migration stories, and ritual knowledge was disrupted by the imposition of colonial administration, Christianization, and population displacement. Indigenous scribes were often forced to translate oral traditions into written forms under European oversight, privileging interpretations that conformed to Spanish historiographical standards while marginalizing communal and ritual contexts. As a result, the Aztlan narrative lost much of its operational function as a legitimizing framework for leadership, social cohesion, and political negotiation. Colonial records reveal how genealogical lines, once central to Mexica authority, were fragmented. Lineages were reinterpreted in Christian terms, ceremonial roles diminished, and previously central migrations became symbolic or allegorical rather than socially enforced. Codices such as the Codex Mendoza and the Florentine Codex preserve elements of origin stories, but they present them in ways that often obscure the original political logic, emphasizing moral, cosmological, or historical commentary instead of functional governance. Archaeological evidence from post-conquest settlements corroborates this disruption. Ritual precincts associated with Aztlan memory were abandoned or repurposed, and the physical markers of ancestral memory were replaced by colonial structures. Interpretive insights highlight the consequences of this disruption. First, Aztlan narratives ceased to operate as a tool for legitimizing authority, weakening elite control and communal cohesion. Second, the imposition of European historiography introduced selective preservation, privileging certain motifs while omitting localized ritual and political practices. Third, despite these disruptions, the narrative persisted in a transformed state, demonstrating the resilience of cultural memory, albeit in codified, textualized, and often depoliticized forms. Yet the narrative survives, transformed. Though stripped of much of its pre-conquest civic and ritual functions, Aztlan remained a reference point in colonial ethnographies, codices, and chronicles, serving as a symbolic anchor for identity, memory, and cultural continuity within the constraints of the colonial order. Its preservation set the stage for later historical, linguistic, and archaeological investigations, providing scholars with a mediated but invaluable record of Mexica origin narratives. Aztlan entered a new theological vocabulary. In the decades following the conquest, missionaries and colonial chroniclers actively reframed indigenous origin narratives within Christian frameworks, seeking to render the Mexica past legible and morally intelligible to European audiences. Bernardino de Sahagun, Diego Duran, and other early chroniclers documented the Aztlan story alongside moral and cosmological commentary, often allegorizing migration, divine command, and ancestral trials in ways that aligned with Christian doctrine. Water, caves, and herons, previously ritual or symbolic markers, were recast as moral or spiritual signifiers, while the 7 caves of Chikamaztoc were interpreted as stages of human testing or divine providence rather than literal or socio-political loci. This process of syncretic reinterpretation served multiple purposes. For missionaries, aligning indigenous narratives with Christian morality facilitated conversion by establishing continuity between pre-Hispanic history and European theological models. For indigenous elites navigating colonial hierarchies, framing Aztlan narratives in Christianized terms allowed partial preservation of ancestral memory, providing a socially acceptable way to transmit identity and lineage. Codical illustrations were sometimes annotated with Spanish glosses, linking pre-Hispanic iconography to biblical analogues or moralized interpretation. In doing so, Aztlan became less a territorial or political reference and more a vehicle for ethical and cosmological instruction. Interpretive observations emphasize the dual function of these adaptations. First, Christianized accounts mediated cultural memory, preserving the narrative while transforming its purpose from political legitimacy to moral exemplarity. Second, this syncretism demonstrates how colonial intellectual culture selectively absorbed and reshaped indigenous knowledge, privileging interpretive frameworks intelligible to European audiences. Third, these early translations set a precedent for subsequent historiography, ensuring that Aztlan narratives continued to circulate, albeit in depoliticized, theologicalized forms. This reinterpretation extends into broader colonial intellectual culture, where Aztlan's memory became embedded in ethnographies, historical chronicles, and legal discourse, maintaining its visibility in the colonial record while signaling a decisive shift from living origin narrative to mediated, moralized historical text. Indigenous writers preserved Aztlan by reshaping it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Nahua chroniclers such as Ximalpahin, Tezozomoc, and Fernando Alvarado Tezozomoc documented migration and origin narratives under the strictures of Spanish colonial authority. Their accounts preserved the memory of Aztlan while adapting it to a European historiographical framework, blending genealogical record-keeping, moralized history, and chronological ordering familiar to colonial administrators. These texts retain core elements of the migration narrative, seven caves, northern origin, sacred guidance, but reinterpret them in ways that aligned with new political and social realities, ensuring that ancestral memory remained legible without challenging colonial hierarchies. Chroniclers frequently synthesized multiple sources: oral tradition, pre-Hispanic codices, and Spanish writings. In doing so, they created layered accounts that both preserved indigenous perspectives and conformed to European expectations of historiography. Genealogies were meticulously recorded, often linking contemporary rulers to the Aztlan migration, while ritual practices and sacred geography were described with explanatory glosses that contextualized them for colonial readers. Symbols such as caves and water remained prominent but were often annotated or explained allegorically, balancing fidelity to tradition with the demands of the colonial milieu. Interpretive insights highlight 3 points. First, these chronicles demonstrate that Aztlan functioned as a resilient mnemonic device, able to survive political and cultural disruption through textual codification. Second, the blending of indigenous and European historiographic conventions illustrates the adaptability of cultural memory, enabling the preservation of narrative content under foreign rule. Third, by maintaining genealogical and ritual references, chroniclers ensured that Aztlan continued to legitimize social identity and elite status, even when the narrative no longer served pre-conquest political functions. The narrative continues evolving into modernity, as these early colonial texts provide the foundation for later ethnographic, historical, and archaeological study. While the functional power of Aztlan as a political and ritual tool had diminished, its textual presence ensured the persistence of ancestral memory, forming a bridge between pre-Hispanic tradition and contemporary historical understanding. The scientific search for Aztlan began centuries after the Mexica fell. Beginning in the 19th century, scholars and archaeologists embarked on systematic efforts to identify the physical locus of the mythic homeland, combining field surveys, comparative iconography, and environmental reconstruction. Early investigators often relied on colonial chronicles, codices, and ethnographic reports, attempting to reconcile symbolic motifs, lagoons, herons, caves, with tangible archaeological sites. Explorations focused on regions including northwestern Mexico, the Bajío, and the northern lakes of central Mexico, assessing the plausibility of settlement continuity, hydrological conditions, and material culture. Archaeological fieldwork traced settlement patterns, fortifications, and ceremonial architecture dating between the Epic Classic and early post-Classic periods, ca. 600 to 1200 CE. Sites such as La Quemada, Pacuime, and settlements in Sinaloa and Nayarit were analyzed for evidence of Nahua-related occupation or cultural influence. Comparative iconography examined parallels between codical representations of water, cave structures, and ritual spaces and their archaeological correlates. Hydrological reconstructions assessed lake basins, marshlands, and river systems extant during the proposed migration window, testing whether these environmental contexts could have supported mobile or semi-sedentary groups. Interpretive insights emerge from these investigations. First, while multiple sites exhibit partial correspondences with codical descriptions, no location satisfies all criteria, reinforcing the symbolic or ancestral function of Aztlan. Second, integrating environmental data with material culture demonstrates that archaeology can illuminate migration plausibility without confirming a precise origin. Third, these investigations highlight methodological rigor. Scholars combine ethnography, codices, and material evidence to evaluate claims systematically, moving beyond speculative association toward structured analysis. Despite extensive fieldwork, the archaeological search has not yielded a definitive site, emphasizing that Aztlan is best understood as a mythic geographic construct rather than a physically locatable settlement. These efforts, however, provide critical insights into northern Mesoamerican cultural landscapes, settlement dynamics, and environmental constraints during the centuries preceding Mexica arrival in the Basin of Mexico. The next frontier was linguistic science, which offered complementary methods to trace Nahua origins through language evolution and population dispersal, independent of material remains. Languages often preserve what stories forget. Modern linguistic and anthropological research has provided a critical lens through which to reassess Nahua origins and the concept of Aztlan. Comparative studies of Uto-Aztecan languages reveal a systematic southward dispersal of Proto-Nahuan speakers from the northern deserts and highlands of Mexico and the southern United States, dating between approximately 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. Phonological innovations, shared vocabulary, and syntactic features allow linguists to reconstruct branching patterns and relative timelines, offering independent evidence of migration that can be compared with codical and archaeological data. These reconstructions suggest that the Mexica and related groups likely emerged from a broad northern cultural linguistic zone, rather than a single geographically fixed Aztlan. Anthropological approaches complement linguistic models. Genetic analyses of contemporary Nahua populations indicate admixture events with central Mexican groups, consistent with southward migration and integration. Ethnographic studies of settlement patterns, ceremonial practices, and lineage organization provide additional context for interpreting codical narratives. By combining linguistic phylogenies with archaeological and ethnographic data, scholars can establish a plausible framework for migration timing, route selection, and social organization, even in the absence of definitive material evidence for Aztlan itself. Interpretive insights emphasize the significance of these methods. First, language preserves signals of long-term human movement, often surviving where mythic narratives become symbolic or politicized. Second, interdisciplinary synthesis, combining linguistics, genetics, and archaeology, demonstrates how multiple strands of evidence can triangulate plausible histories for populations otherwise obscured by myth. Third, these approaches highlight that Aztlan functions more as a cultural memory marker than a precise geographic reference, encoding the broad ancestral origin of Nahua-speaking peoples rather than a single site. Contemporary identities also reshape Aztlan. Modern Nahua communities, scholars, and cultural movements draw upon the mythic homeland as a symbol of heritage, continuity, and indigenous rights, illustrating that Aztlan's relevance extends beyond historical reconstruction into contemporary social and political contexts. Aztlan became a symbol far beyond its mythical past. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the narrative of a northern homeland was reinterpreted to serve nationalist, cultural, and identity-building agendas. Mexican intellectuals during the post-independence period integrated Aztlan into discourses of pre-Hispanic heritage, framing it as a foundational element of the nation's indigenous past. Archaeological discoveries and colonial-era codices were employed selectively to construct a narrative emphasizing continuity, resilience, and cultural sophistication, positioning Aztlan as both a historical and symbolic anchor for Mexican identity. This reinterpretation emphasized ancestral legitimacy and cultural pride, linking the modern nation to the migratory and creative achievements of pre-Columbian peoples. In the United States, Aztlan assumed a prominent role within Chicano nationalist and cultural movements from the 1960s onward. Activists and scholars invoked the concept as a locus of ancestral memory, framing the American Southwest as the historic homeland of Mexican and indigenous peoples displaced by colonization and border formation. Literature, murals, political manifestos, and educational initiatives drew upon Aztlan to foster community cohesion, cultural affirmation, and claims to land and civil rights, demonstrating the enduring power of mythic geography to shape collective identity. Symbols associated with Aztlan, herons, lakes, and migration motifs were frequently adapted into visual and literary culture, linking historical imagination to contemporary socio-political activism. Interpretive insights highlight the transformative adaptability of Aztlan. First, the myth functions as a flexible cultural tool, capable of bridging pre-Hispanic, colonial, and modern contexts. Second, its reinterpretation reflects the ways in which historical memory can be mobilized for social and political purposes, often divorced from empirical verification. Third, Aztlan demonstrates how ancient narratives retain relevance as symbolic geography, shaping conceptions of heritage, belonging, and identity across centuries and borders. To conclude, we examine the long-term legacy of Aztlan, from codical mnemonic to political instrument to modern cultural emblem, tracing its persistent capacity to mediate memory, identity, and historical imagination across time. Even myths can anchor scientific debate. Despite the absence of a verifiable physical location, Aztlan continues to occupy a central position in Mesoamerican historiography and interdisciplinary research. Scholars engage with the concept not as a fixed site but as a framework for understanding migration, cultural memory, and identity formation among Nahua-speaking peoples. Academic inquiry draws upon codices, colonial chronicles, archaeological evidence, linguistic reconstructions, and genetic data to contextualize Aztlan within broader patterns of north-to-south population movements in Mesoamerica. The debate demonstrates how mythic narratives can structure empirical investigation, guiding research questions, comparative methodology, and interpretive frameworks even when the object itself remains intangible. Interpretive insights emphasize Aztlan's historiographical role. First, it exemplifies the interplay between textual, archaeological, and linguistic sources, showing how scholars triangulate data to evaluate cultural memory. Second, it highlights the limitations of reconstructive methods, revealing that some historical phenomena, particularly those encoded as myth, resist precise localization or empirical confirmation. Third, Aztlan serves as a heuristic device, allowing researchers to trace long-term social and demographic processes, assess migration plausibility, and explore the evolution of Nahua identity across centuries. The enduring scholarly attention reflects the richness of the codical and ethno-historical record, as well as the interpretive challenges posed by symbolic narratives. By remaining a topic of active debate, Aztlan ensures that questions about origin, migration, and identity retain relevance in contemporary Mesoamerican studies. The continued examination of its sources and representations encourages methodological rigor, interdisciplinary collaboration, and a nuanced appreciation of how myth and history interact. The legacy extends beyond scholarship, influencing modern cultural identity, political discourse, and popular understanding of indigenous heritage. Aztlan endures as memory even when its geography fades. Across centuries, indigenous communities and broader Mexican society have maintained narratives of northern origin, embedding them in rituals, oral traditions, art, and collective identity. Among Nahua groups in central Mexico, the memory of Aztlan persists in genealogical storytelling, ceremonial commemoration, and educational discourse, often emphasizing migration, sacred guidance, and ancestral lineages. These practices preserve cultural continuity, connecting contemporary communities to a perceived ancestral homeland, even without a concrete geographic reference. The narratives function as social glue, reinforcing kinship, communal cohesion, and a sense of historical rootedness within a dynamic cultural landscape. Beyond indigenous practice, Aztlan has been integrated into Mexican national consciousness, academic research, and popular culture. Museums, literature, murals, and school curricula reference the mythic homeland as a symbol of pre-Columbian achievement and identity. This incorporation highlights the symbolic flexibility of Aztlan. It can operate simultaneously as a historical heuristic, a tool of cultural affirmation, and a political metaphor. In Chicano communities of the United States, Aztlan is invoked as a locus of heritage, resistance, and collective memory, linking modern social movements to imagined ancestral landscapes. These applications underscore the capacity of mythic geography to mediate identity across borders and generations, demonstrating the enduring power of narrative even when detached from material verification. Interpretive observations reveal three key dynamics. First, Aztlan exemplifies how cultural memory preserves continuity in the absence of empirical geography. Second, it illustrates the coexistence of mythic and historical consciousness, where symbolic landscapes complement factual understanding. Third, the persistence of Aztlan highlights the adaptive potential of origin narratives, allowing communities to assert identity, continuity, and legitimacy across changing socio-political contexts. This culminates in a final assessment, evaluating Aztlan as both a historical construct and a living element of cultural imagination, demonstrating its multi-layered significance from pre-Hispanic migration narrative to contemporary symbol of heritage and identity. Aztlan's significance lies not in where it was, but in what it meant. Across the centuries, the mythic homeland functioned as a multidimensional instrument for Nahua communities, shaping social, political, and cultural life even in the absence of a verifiable geographic locus. In its earliest textual attestations, Aztlan served as a mythic charter, providing genealogical and migratory narratives that structured tribal cohesion, lineage differentiation, and communal identity. The symbolism embedded in caves, water, and herons codified shared ancestry, guiding social organization and ritual practice. Even when codical or archaeological evidence cannot confirm its location, these symbolic markers retained operational significance in early Mexica society. During the migration and settlement phases, Aztlan became a political and strategic tool, reinforcing leadership legitimacy and aligning sacred guidance with practical navigation of ecological and social landscapes. It provided a narrative framework for negotiating alliances, asserting claims over new territories, and differentiating the Mexica from neighboring polities. In the imperial period, the concept was fully politicized, integrated into ceremonial rhetoric, codical representation, and diplomatic discourse, demonstrating how memory could underpin governance, tribute collection, and state ideology. After the Spanish conquest, Aztlan's function shifted from operative to symbolic, preserved through Christianized chronicling, codical annotation, and colonial historiography. In modern scholarship and cultural memory, Aztlan continues to operate as both a heuristic and a cultural anchor. Linguistic and genetic studies trace plausible migration corridors, while indigenous and national narratives leverage the homeland as a symbol of identity, heritage, and continuity. Its enduring relevance highlights how mythic geography can mediate collective memory, reinforce social cohesion, and inspire cultural resilience, even when the physical landscape has faded from memory.